My name is Nemesio Oseguera, but the world knows me as El Menchito. For years I lived in the shadow of a man who turned Mexico's underworld into a silent empire. That man was my father, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho. But this isn't a story about him. Not really. This is a story about what I learned standing beside him, watching him conquer a nation without ever firing a shot in its direction. This is about the invisible war, the one fought with briefcases instead of bullets, with signatures instead of sicarios. And now, after years of silence, after watching the empire expand, fracture, and consume itself from within, I'm going to tell you how we did it. How we reached Washington, D.C., without anyone even knowing we were there. I remember the exact moment my father taught me the most important lesson of my life. We were in a safe house outside Guadalajara, late 2013. The Gulf Cartel had just lost a bloody confrontation with Los Zetas in Tamaulipas, bodies hanging from bridges, messages carved into flesh, entire towns paralyzed by fear. My father watched the news coverage with cold, calculating eyes. "You see this?" he said, gesturing at the screen. "This is how you lose. This is how you make yourself a target. They're screaming their power to the world, and every scream brings the military, the DEA, the fucking Marines." He turned to me, and I'll never forget the intensity in his gaze. "Real power doesn't announce itself, mijo. Real power moves in silence." That philosophy became our blueprint. While other cartels fought territorial wars that made headlines, we built something different. We built infrastructure. My father understood what others didn't. The United States wasn't a border to cross. It was a system to infiltrate. Every institution, every agency, every mechanism designed to stop us. They all had cracks. They all had men inside who were tired, underpaid, overlooked, or simply willing to look the other way for the right price. We didn't need to fight the American government. We needed to become invisible within it. That was the revolution my father engineered, and I was his architect, his silent partner in building an empire that would stretch from Jalisco to the halls of power in Washington. The early years were about learning the landscape. My father sent me north repeatedly, not to move product but to study. I spent months in San Antonio, Houston, Los Angeles, not as a narco but as a ghost. I rented apartments, opened bank accounts, registered shell companies. I learned how Americans lived, how their systems worked, where the surveillance was tight and where it was theatrical. I discovered that in a country obsessed with security, the greatest security flaw was assumption. They assumed cartels were violent, chaotic, stupid. They assumed we'd come in guns blazing. They never imagined we'd come wearing suits, carrying legal documents, speaking perfect English, moving money through channels so legitimate that even forensic accountants couldn't trace them without warrants they'd never get. By 2014, we had established what we called Las Rutas Fantasmas, the ghost routes. These weren't drug corridors in the traditional sense. They were networks of legitimate businesses that moved our product alongside legal goods. Trucking companies that hauled furniture and appliances from Mexican factories to American warehouses. Import-export firms that specialized in automotive parts. Even agricultural. Distributors shipping avocados and limes. Mexican produce that American consumers couldn't get enough of. Every shipment was documented, inspected, certified, and hidden within those legal loads, moved with such precision and care that border agents saw exactly what they expected to see. Nothing. We didn't fight the system. We became part of it. The genius was in the layering. We never put all our weight on one route, one company, one contact. Everything was distributed, compartmentalized, redundant. If one channel got compromised, 10 others kept flowing. We used lawyers to set up corporations, accountants to manage books that would pass any audit, real estate agents to acquire properties that served as distribution nodes. These weren't criminals. Most of them had no idea who they were really working for. They dealt with intermediaries, with representatives of Mexican business interests looking to expand north. Everything was professional, everything was legal on paper, and beneath that paper trail, millions of dollars in product flowed north and hundreds of millions in cash flowed south. My father's strategy was patience incarnate. Other cartels wanted immediate expansion, quick profits, visible dominance. We played the long game. We spent 2 years just building infrastructure before moving any significant weight. We invested in legitimate businesses, made them profitable, established them as respected entities in their communities. A trucking company in Laredo. That became one of the most reliable cross-border haulers, praised by clients for never missing a delivery. A produce distributor in Atlanta that supplied restaurants across the Southeast, known for quality and consistency. a real estate investment firm in Phoenix that renovated properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods. None of them had obvious cartel connections. All of them were ours. But infrastructure was only half the equation. The other half was corruption, and this is where my father's genius truly shone. He understood that corruption in America wasn't like corruption in Mexico. You couldn't just hand a briefcase of cash to a border agent and expect loyalty. American officials needed deniability, distance, the illusion that they weren't really compromised, so we gave them that. We created separation. Instead of direct payments, we offered consulting fees through legitimate firms. We provided investment opportunities in businesses that would actually generate returns. We gave them plausible deniability, legal cover, and just enough moral distance to let them sleep at night while they looked the other way. The men we cultivated weren't always obvious targets. Sure, we had border agents who waved certain trucks through without thorough inspection, but we also had customs officials who expedited paperwork for favored clients, logistics coordinators who ensured specific shipments got priority processing, and warehouse managers who didn't ask questions about after-hours deliveries. None of them thought of themselves as working for a cartel. They thought of themselves as helping legitimate Mexican businesses navigate American bureaucracy, maybe cutting a few corners for extra income. The beauty was in the ambiguity. They could tell themselves they weren't really criminals, just pragmatists working within a broken system. By 2016, the machine was running smoothly. We had established cells throughout the American Southwest and Southeast, not enforcement cells, but business cells. Groups of professionals managing our interests, most of whom had no idea they were connected to anything illegal. The compartmentalization was absolute. A lawyer in Dallas setting up shell corporations didn't know he was enabling the same network as a warehouse manager in Memphis, who occasionally accepted unmarked shipments. A real estate agent in San Antonio selling properties to our intermediaries had no connection to the accountant in Phoenix managing our investment portfolios. They were pieces on a board so vast that even I, who helped design it, couldn't see all the connections simultaneously. Act 2. The Phantom Network. The expansion into the American interior required a different kind of thinking. We couldn't rely on traditional border smuggling techniques once product was north. Highway checkpoints, police stops, DEA task forces made traditional transportation too risky. So we created a distribution network that looked nothing like what law enforcement expected. We established a series of seemingly unrelated businesses across key cities, each serving as a node in our network. A chain of auto repair shops in Texas and Louisiana. A franchise of small shipping stores across the Southeast. Even a network of independent motels along major highways. None of them obvious narco fronts. All of them ours. The auto repair shops were particularly clever. They were legitimate businesses, employing real mechanics who did real work on customer vehicles. But they also had modification bays in the back, where specialized teams installed hidden compartments in vehicles, not for moving drugs, but for moving cash. Soccer moms and businessmen would drop off their cars for routine maintenance, and while mechanics changed oil and rotated tires, our teams installed compartments so sophisticated that even trained K9 units couldn't detect them. These customers had no idea. They picked up their cars, drove them wherever they needed to go, and somewhere along their journey, our people would access those compartments, remove the cash, replace it with legitimate cargo, and disappear. The customer never knew they'd been an unwitting courier. The shipping stores were our communication hubs. These small franchise locations, the kind where people mail packages, rent mailboxes, and make copies, became dead drop points and message centers. We used encrypted codes embedded in legitimate business transactions. A customer would come in to ship a package, use specific phrases when requesting services, and our employee would retrieve a pre-prepared envelope from the back. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal business transaction. Even the employees mostly didn't understand the system. They followed protocols that seemed like corporate efficiency procedures. Only the managers knew, and even they only knew their piece of the puzzle. The motel network was perhaps our most audacious move. We acquired a series of independent motels along I-35, I-10, and I-20, the major east-west and north-south routes. These weren't cartel safe houses in any traditional sense. They were functioning businesses with legitimate guests, families on road trips, salesmen passing through. But certain rooms, the ones at the end of corridors or in separated sections, were reserved for corporate accounts. These rooms had reinforced doors, soundproofing, and hidden floor safes. They became our waypoints. Product would arrive at one motel, be stored temporarily, then move to the next node. Cash would flow in reverse, all of it under the cover of normal motel operations. The key to everything was the suburban strategy. My father realized that American law enforcement focused on urban areas and border zones, places where cartels traditionally operated. So we moved into suburbs, quiet neighborhoods outside San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Phoenix, Atlanta. We bought or rented ordinary houses, middle-class homes in cul-de-sacs where neighbors knew each other's names. We placed couples there, sometimes real married pairs from our organization, sometimes arranged partnerships that looked legitimate. They had jobs, mowed lawns, attended neighborhood barbecues. They were invisible. And in their garages or basements, they stored hundreds of kilos and millions in cash. I remember one house in particular, just outside Laredo. Pecan Street, a quiet residential area where kids rode bikes and people washed cars on weekends. We bought a 3-bedroom ranch house through a real estate trust, placed a couple there, Carlos and Marina, both former teachers from Michoacan who'd worked for us for years. They became the perfect American suburban couple. Carlos got a job at a local hardware store. Marina volunteered at the library. They hosted a 4th of July barbecue where neighbors came over for burgers and beer, and every 3 weeks a plumbing supply truck would arrive, deliver equipment to the garage, and leave. That garage held more product than some warehouses. Neighbors thought they were just a nice Mexican couple living the American dream. The Atlanta operation was even more sophisticated. We established an entire infrastructure around the city's thriving Latino business community. We created a produce distribution company that actually served real restaurants, quality Mexican and Central American ingredients that chefs loved. The business was genuinely profitable, with legitimate clients who had no cartel connections. But embedded within that supply chain was our real operation. Certain shipments contained modified crates with false bottoms. Specific delivery routes included stops at our safe houses. The drivers, most of them unaware, would make their regular deliveries, and at certain stops, quality control inspectors would offload the modified crates, replacing them with identical legitimate cargo. The system was so clean that even if police had surveilled our warehouses 24/7, they would have seen nothing but a successful immigrant business. The banking infrastructure was where my education really paid off. I spent years studying American financial regulations, learning the thresholds that triggered reporting requirements, understanding how banks monitored transactions for suspicious activity. We didn't try to move large sums through obvious channels. Instead, we created networks of small accounts, staying under reporting limits. We used cashier's checks and money. Orders purchased at different locations, never creating patterns. We established credit unions and community banks in areas with large immigrant populations, institutions that were less sophisticated in their monitoring but fully legal and regulated. We became experts at structuring transactions to avoid triggering alerts, spreading our financial activity across so many institutions that no single bank would ever see the full picture. The cryptocurrency phase, starting around 2017, opened entirely new possibilities. Bitcoin and other digital currencies gave us what we'd always wanted: movement of value without traditional banking infrastructure. We established mining operations disguised as tech startups, used peer-to-peer exchanges that operated in legal gray areas, and moved funds across borders with transfers that existed only as code on blockchain ledgers. Law enforcement was years behind understanding this technology. While they monitored wire transfers and cash movements, we were moving millions in cryptocurrency, converting it through legitimate exchanges, and bringing it back as clean business investment. But the most valuable asset we acquired wasn't infrastructure or money. It was information. My father understood that intelligence was the ultimate advantage. So we cultivated sources inside the systems designed to stop us. Not just corrupt officials who looked the other way, but actual intelligence leaks. We had people who had access to law enforcement databases, who could tell us when our names appeared in investigations, when warrants were being drafted, when operations were being planned. These weren't traditional paid informants. Many of them were ideological, people who opposed the war on drugs, who believed prohibition created more problems than drugs themselves. They saw themselves as whistleblowers, not criminals. We just pointed them in the right directions. One source in particular changed everything. I'll never use his real name, but he worked in a federal agency that coordinated border enforcement. He wasn't high-ranking, just a mid-level analyst who processed intelligence reports. But he had access to databases that tracked investigations across multiple agencies. He became disillusioned with what he called the futility of interdiction strategy, the endless cycle of arrests and seizures that never actually stopped drug flow. When our intermediaries approached him, it wasn't with cash or threats. It was with philosophy. They engaged him in conversations about drug policy, about harm reduction, about the failures of prohibition. They never asked him to do anything illegal. They just asked him to share his academic observations about which enforcement strategies were effective and which weren't. Through him, we learned which ports of entry had enhanced inspection protocols, which routes were under satellite surveillance, which trucking companies were being monitored. We learned about joint task forces before they launched, about wiretaps before they went active, about confidential informants before they could do damage. The information wasn't always specific. He was careful never to reveal operational details that would make him obviously compromised. But it was enough. Enough to shift our routes, change our schedules, rotate our personnel. Enough to stay 2 steps ahead of every investigation. And he convinced himself he wasn't helping criminals. He was just sharing analysis about ineffective policies with people who were trying to understand the system. The network of corrupted officials grew organically. Once you have one source, they lead to others. A customs agent who accepts consulting fees knows other agents with similar financial pressures. A warehouse supervisor who looks the other way knows logistics coordinators at other facilities. A local police officer who tips us about raids knows detectives in other jurisdictions. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a web of individual compromises, each person only knowing their own small betrayal, none of them seeing the full picture. That was the genius. No grand conspiracy to uncover, no cartel org chart for law enforcement to dismantle. Just 1,000 small corruptions, each deniable, each seemingly insignificant alone. By 2018, we had achieved something unprecedented. We had distribution networks in 15 states. We had legitimate business revenues that dwarfed our drug income, companies that were actually profitable, employing hundreds of people who had no idea who really owned them. We had real estate portfolios worth hundreds of millions. We had investment accounts in brokerage firms managed by Wall Street professionals. We had become what my father always envisioned, a business empire that happened to traffic drugs, rather than a drug cartel that happened to do business. The distinction seemed small, but it was everything. It meant we were embedded in the legitimate economy, protected by layers of corporate structure and legal complexity. The reach extended beyond what even I had anticipated. We had business interests that brought us into contact with politicians, not as criminals but as legitimate Mexican investors interested in cross-border trade. We attended business conferences, made donations to economic development initiatives, sponsored community programs. We hired lobbying firms to advocate for policies that benefited our legitimate businesses, lower tariffs on Mexican goods, streamlined border processing, infrastructure improvements at ports of entry. These lobbyists had no idea they were being paid with cartel money. They were just working for clients listed as Mexican agricultural and manufacturing interests. And through them, we influenced policy discussions in state legislatures and occasionally even in Washington. The closest we came to direct Washington contact was through a consulting firm we retained in 2019. They specialized in trade policy and border security, advising companies on navigating customs regulations and importing compliance. We paid them substantial fees to help our legitimate businesses operate more efficiently across the border. Through them, we gained insights into pending regulatory changes, proposed enforcement initiatives, and congressional discussions about border policy. They would brief us on upcoming changes, allowing us to adapt our operations before new rules took effect. They had no idea their biggest client was a cartel front. To them, we were just another Mexican business group trying to succeed in the American market. ACT3. The Invisible Empire. The empire became self-sustaining, almost alive in its complexity. By 2020, the infrastructure we'd built had grown beyond anyone's complete understanding, mine included. We had operations I only discovered when reviewing financial reports, businesses acquired by our shell corporations that I'd never personally approved. The system had become so sophisticated, so layered with legitimate activity, that even forensic investigators couldn't easily distinguish between legal operations and criminal ones. That was exactly the point, but it was also the beginning of our vulnerability. An empire built on secrecy can collapse under the weight of its own shadows. The COVID-19 pandemic should have destroyed us. Border restrictions, supply chain disruptions, lockdowns, everything that made our system work was suddenly threatened. But instead we adapted and thrived. While traditional cartels struggled with enforcement crackdowns and border closures, our legitimate business infrastructure became an advantage. Our trucking companies were classified as essential services, moving food and medical supplies. Our import-export operations handled PPE and pharmaceuticals. We were more legitimate than ever, and beneath that legitimacy, we moved more product than at any time in our history. When everyone else was locked down, we were essential. Workers. The most sophisticated operation we ever ran was what we called El Laberinto, the labyrinth. It was a financial structure so complex that even our own accountants needed flowcharts to understand it. At its center was a series of offshore holding companies registered in Panama, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. These held controlling interests in Mexican corporations, which owned American LLCs, which invested in real estate trusts and private equity funds. Money would enter this labyrinth as drug proceeds and emerge as legitimate investment returns, having passed through so many legal transactions that tracing it back became practically impossible. We had lawyers in 3 countries managing this structure, none of whom knew the full scope of what they were maintaining. The real estate portfolio alone was staggering. By 2021, we owned or controlled properties worth over $800 million across the American Southwest. Shopping centers, apartment complexes, office buildings, even a small hotel chain. These weren't cartel safe houses. They were genuine income-producing properties managed by professional real estate firms. The revenues they generated were completely legal, providing perfect vehicles for laundering money from our drug operations. We'd use cash proceeds to make improvements to properties, increasing their value, then refinance them through legitimate banks, receiving clean money in return. The properties themselves appreciated, making the entire structure profitable even without the laundering benefit. But with scale came exposure we hadn't anticipated. The larger our legitimate business empire grew, the more attention it attracted, not from law enforcement, but from business competitors and investigative journalists. In 2021, a regional business magazine did a profile on the mysterious Mexican investors who'd acquired significant commercial real estate in Texas. The article was admiring, calling us savvy operators who'd identified undervalued markets. But it also asked questions we preferred remain unasked. Who exactly owned these holding companies? Why were the beneficial owners so difficult to identify? Why did the corporate structures include so many offshore entities? The article didn't suggest criminality, just curiosity about secretive but apparently successful business people. That article triggered something I hadn't expected. Due diligence. Some of our properties were in publicly traded real estate investment trusts. When questions emerged about the ownership structure of major stakeholders, compliance departments began investigating. They weren't looking for drug money. They were just following anti-money laundering regulations, checking boxes, doing standard KYC procedures. But our structure, designed to hide criminal proceeds, looked suspicious even when scrutinized for routine compliance reasons. Suddenly, lawyers were asking questions that couldn't easily be answered. Banks wanted to understand